Gupta. I have not met so many of you, but I've met some of you, and I'd love to meet all of you. So that's my aim. I'll start with a land acknowledgement that will situate me and my relationship to what I do and what we're doing here today. So, as we know, we are on the unceded ancestral lands of the Okanagan peoples. And I make this acknowledgement in part because I recognize that I benefit financially from working in a colonial institution and for the many privileges that accompany my position. So this also means that I call out colonial practices and support actions that redress the policies, processes, and practices both within the university but also beyond it. So a little bit about me. I'm an assistant professor in anthropology. I'm an archaeologist by training. I'm also director of the DARE Lab and a partner with Poetic Justice Foundation on organizing today's event, OVERCASTE, Unsettling Caste, Power and Belonging on Stolen Land. So this event, and in fact our entire collaboration, is funded by the Community University Engagement Support Program here at UBC. As part of this, we also acknowledge and thank Belonging Matters, NANAK Foods, and especially Prisha Walia and also the Indian Student Association. Thank you very, very much. So this is actually our second event on Caste that we have held on campus. Our very first was actually a panel last April with Dr. Chinaya Jangam, who came in from Carleton University, and opened OVERCASTE. This is a powerful traveling exhibit that Anita and Dr. Sharanjit Sandra have curated, and OVERCASTE is actually doing its return to the Okanagan and has been up in the comments this afternoon. So if you haven't seen it, you might have a few minutes. But not right now, you gotta stay here. We are so delighted that you're part of today's conversation with our distinguished panelists. Dalit feminist scholar Dr. Shikha Diwakar from McGill University, from Kai Nation activist and graduate student at Simon Fraser University, Ty Bryant, and author of Indians on Indian Land, and associate professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, Dr. Nishant Upadhyay. So please give our panelists a warm welcome. So before we jump into their introductions, which I'm going to ask them to do, I want to just very quickly explain what caste is. So caste refers to a Hindu system of hereditary, endogamous, which is in-group, and stratified or tiered social groupings that are based on purity, on profession, and on patriarchy. Caste-based discrimination is banned in India. However, it is practiced within and across every religious community in South Asia. And it's linked to the ownership of resources, access to opportunities, and control over women's bodies and sexuality. And that's one of the reasons why we thought it was important for us to bring this conversation to our campus, because there are so many of us here. So I'll now invite Shikha to start with the introductions. Do you want the mic?
No, good.
Sure?
I hope I'm audible to everyone. If you want, I can use my phone.
Use the mic? Yeah, for this one.
Just go ahead and record.
Hi, I'm Shikha. I missed the part that I need to do my introduction. So, I recently completed my PhD from McGill University. And my work is around caste and gender, and in higher education, around lived experiences, and also around research ethics. Apart from that, I have been engaging with a lot of transnational projects around caste and coloniality, especially through the storytelling traditions. And I have also been engaging in writing practices, ethics of writing practices, and research methods. Other than that, the fun thing about me, I really love chai, so and that's an important part of my introduction.
Can see. you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you so much. Excuse me being an iPad baby tonight. I have a laptop in front of me that I'll be reading off of because I have like pretty bad brain fog from being sick for a while. Now I'm better. I'm going to wear a mask when I'm walking around, but I want to be as clear as I can be tonight. So yeah, Gilkuzla everybody. Thank you so much to the organizers for having me here this evening. My name is Ty Bryant. I'm a member of Wewokai First Nation. I'm a scholar activist working out of and is sometimes constrained by Simon Fraser University. And I'm the co-founder of Asian Indigenous Relations Collective, which simply put is an intergenerational coalition of folks from across Turtle Island who all care and tend to forms of Asian Indigenous relations. And we weave in and out of the university. I'm going to explain a bit how my life and work is anchored in knowing that new forms of solidarity are not only possible but achievable, and that modes of belonging not contingent on settler states are necessary for collective liberation. This is the pathway through knowing me and what I do and my relationship with Never Ceded Lands. And so I'll begin by interpolating the introduction to the poetry collection, Not Vanishing, by Menominee Two-Spirit poet and activist Christos. This was actually published by Press Gang, which is about 20 minutes from where I live, so a little nerdy fact. But here we go. Because there are so many myths and misconceptions about Native people, it is important to clarify myself to the folks in the room who do not know me. I was not born on the reservation, but in Vancouver, part of a group called Urban Indians by the government. I grew up around Black, Latin, Asian, and white people, and I'm shaped by that experience, as well as what my mother taught me. She had been taught to be ashamed and has never spoken our language to me. Much of the fury which erupts from my work is a result of seeing the pain that white culture has caused my mother. It continues to give a pain to all of us. While I'm deeply spiritual, to share this with strangers would be a violation. Our rituals, stories, and religious practices as Wewokai have been stolen and abused, as has our land. I don't publish work which would encourage this, so you will find no creation that is here tonight. My purpose is to make it as clear and as inescapable as possible what the actual material conditions of our lives are. So when I think about this, I'm thinking historically, contemporarily about hunger, infant mortality, forced sterilization, treaty violations, the plague of alcohol and drugs, ridiculous jail terms, denial of civil rights, radiation poisoning, land theft, endless contrived legal battles which drain our wills, even amongst our own peoples, corrupt treaty governments, harassment, and a death drive at the hands of the VPD, RCMP, CSIS, CBSA, DFO, and all manifestations of the fraudulent settler colonial state and the realities we face. So don't admire what you perceive as our stoicism or spirituality as Native peoples, or flatten us into a singular entity. Work for our lives is to continue in our own ways. So I'm grounding much of my introduction tonight in the words of Christos to make it clear and as inescapable as possible what the actual material conditions of my life has been. And to be as a good sociologist as C. Wright Mills would say, or to be a good relative like a Native auntie would say, we must connect ourselves to the larger structures and systems that our imaginations are often constrained by to dream beyond them. So I believe that a lot of my work just doesn't stop there. It's about thinking about Asian Indigenous relational practice on the ground, which is the meeting of knowledge and action. And I'm here to speak to some of that tonight, including what I've done with the Asian Indigenous Relations Collective, as well as my work with multiple generations of Taiwanese settlers on stolen Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands, as thinking beyond the settler state and thinking a lot about what it means to enact Asian Indigenous relationality, especially with a group who has newly arrived to the settler colony of Canada. Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Nishant. I am coming from the lands of Fuchsia and Arapaho peoples, which is known as Colorado, which is in the so-called country of the United States. I teach ethnic studies there, and it's a really an honor to be here. Thank you, Neha, for bringing us here, and for my panelists, Shikha and Ty, to be part of this conversation, and such a great turnout, so thank you for being here. I'm sure you had 1,000 different places to be at, and you chose here. That means a lot for all of us. I'm the author of the book called Indians on Indian Lands, Intersections of Race, Caste, Indigeneity, where I try to understand what does it mean for people like me who are dominant caste Hindus who have come to Canada and become settlers here. And so I try to understand what does it mean to be a settler? As a lot of us say, we are racialized, we are people of color, but carry these privileges of being a settler, what Neha was pointing at the beginning, but then how the caste also travels from South Asia to here, right? A lot of us growing up in India, South Asia, or in the diaspora have been told that caste is not a thing, caste was a thing in the past, caste has been decriminalized, not decriminalized. bad. Yeah, and historic, right? And it happens in rural areas and whatnot, but in urban areas it's not a thing, and especially not a thing in the diaspora. But I come from a Brahmin family, and getting to know, understand what social justice means and to show up in solidarity with different communities, realizing that how caste carries with me, even if I can say that I have nothing to do with that structure, right? But being part of that structure, being brought up in that structure, caste continues, especially as a Brahmin, coming from a Brahmin family, in how the Indian state runs, everything that happens and is happening in the Indian state, historically and now, and everything that happens in the Indian diaspora in North America, in Canada, in US, so caste just plays a significant role, right? And so to understand what caste and then settler colonialism, how they intersect, and how a lot of us, the way we engage with indigenous people, we carry this background of caste with us, right? And so I did field work in Vancouver, in Fort McMurray, Alberta, and Toronto with South Asians, Indians, to understand how do we relate to indigenous people, but also how do we carry caste with ourselves that oppresses Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi people in India, but also is used to oppress indigenous and black communities and other communities in North America, right? And so, so the book tries to answer what does it mean to be a settler, and what does it mean to then also think about caste in the diaspora when we've been told that caste is not a thing that shapes us here. Thanks.
That's for you all.
Okay.
Thanks, Shikha, Ty, and Nishant. Let's sort of move into our conversation now. So I want to start by reading a quote. Comes from a book. As I said, I'm an archaeologist. I will read all of those books. And it's called The Personality of India. It was written in 1953 by an archaeologist called Vendapudi Subbarao. And in this book, this entire book, he charts the history of cultural groups within post-independent India. And in the passage that I'll read, he specifically refers to the relationship between the indigenous or tribal or Adivasi peoples and Hindu caste society. So he says, we should not forget that the so-called tribal areas are also the chief resources of raw materials like minerals and timber. This has probably enabled a harmonious development of the higher cultures of the plain and the lower cultures of the hills and forests, maintaining each other's economies and institutions without much interference. So my first question for my distinguished panelists is on that concept of settler. As you said, Nishant, this is a term that many of us use when we're self-locating on indigenous lands. So what does the term settler mean to you? Shikha, can I ask you to start us off?
Thank you for that question. Actually, that question is really important. When I moved here first, it's been 7 years, when I moved here for my PhD, and my first exposure to indigenous histories here in North America was through land acknowledgement. And I realized that the history of Canada is much beyond when they say, oh, it's a land of opportunities. There is a history of land disposition as well. So I realized that I need to educate myself, because coming from a Dalit community, coming from one of the marginalized communities, I cannot talk about caste in absence of other oppressions. So the first thing that I wanted to understand about my relationship with this land, and the term that kept coming back to me was settler. But also, given that we are diverse, we come from a different histories, it is really important to understand this term, settler, and I don't want to loosely use it. And even when I'm explaining my relationship to this land and coming from a Dalit community, I do not pretend that I'm outside this colonial capitalistic culture. Like how Neha said in land acknowledgement, we are benefited through financially and other aspect. So this was one of the questions that I actively reflected, that what is racialized, how am I a racialized settler, given that I come from the history that my community, the land was stolen from my community, the resources were stolen from my communities. So, how do I identify as settler, but not also homogenize with other people of color too. So there is this author that I read a lot, like there is a critical Muslim scholar, Dr. Shikha Diwakar. She wrote an amazing paper, We Cannot Write About Complicity Together. And I'm quoting her, she said, "I'm exhausted by the move of homogenizing all South Asian as settler of same kind. A move often made by Brahmins and Savarnas as they bring Dalit and caste oppressed Muslim into the fold of complicity while erasing their local and transnational Brahminical supremacy, power, and its historical and ongoing role in consolidating white supremacy." So yes, I'm a settler on a stolen indigenous land, but we are not homogeneous. We do not all arrive with the same histories of power, and the caste violence has historically denied the community access to land and resources. So when I talk about my settlerism, I talk about that yes, I'm coming from the similar histories, and when I talk about my relationship, it comes from the point of solidarity. And for me to self-locate as a settler is not just about naming a position. It's also about thinking, taking accountability. When I started my PhD, apart from my research questions, I had set up reflective questions as well. And thanks to my supervisor, he played a really big role in helping me understand the relationship with the land and the indigenous communities. And so, apart from my research questions, the reflective questions that me and my supervisor actually think about was, how do I do this work ethically? Like when I'm talking about caste, I cannot talk about caste without talking about colonialism. And over the period of time, I saw how caste and colonialism is working together. So the meaning for me as a settler changes because I have a shared history, if not similar. And I need to keep that nature in the center, and my understanding of settlerism comes from the point of solidarity. So that's my understanding of settler.
I find that really interesting because for me, my relationship to the term settler is also out of a inter-indigenous solidarity, like framework, right? Because it feels a little bit funny to loop myself in with like the Asian diasporic communities I'm working with in the same exact way by calling myself a settler, but I understand by my proximity to stolen land that isn't actually my ancestors or my nations that I'm still implicated, right, in the material conditions that I'm working in. So as I'm kind of responding and thinking to this, I am still speaking like on this from the vantage point as someone who has never really had to confront the weight in the same way as other folks on this panel. And I'm more so interested in helping Asian diasporic folks relocate themselves and their communities in relation to indigeneity and land, which is a big theme of what I'll be talking about here today. So, settler. We can't really seem to make our minds up about what this conversation is actually doing for us. I'm taking us in a bit of a different direction, and I'm kind of venting a little bit, I would say. We can't even move a lot of this discourse, especially in Asian indigenous relationality, beyond setting the terms and conditions of our discussion. So it kind of morphs, in my view, into a sort of identity politics, where it's very difficult for folks to move beyond deploying the term settler into something materially oriented and in relationship to solidarity, and rather becomes this kind of framework and key term in an institutional identity. I'm not saying this is what all folks do, but it kind of runs its course in the same way a land acknowledgement could. That's kind of the point I'm trying to get at here. So really specifically in the work that I do, I'm thinking about the ways in which the Asian diasporic community as a larger formation, and culturally specifically, Taiwanese folks have been thinking about the relationship to indigeneity. There's a lot of words for this. There's refugee settler, there's alien, there's colonizer, there's arrivant, there's Asian settler ally, there's undesired immigrants, minor settler, co-colonizer. These are all terms and conditions of settlerhood that have been discussed for the last 10 to 20 years in literature. But one thing that I've been reckoning with in doing my lit review and thinking about these terms, this isn't coming up in community. This isn't coming up with elders. This isn't coming up with youth. So I'm trying to think about this kind of disconnect between how settler is deployed in the literature and these paradigm shifts and kind of breaking through a native settler binary and thinking about these specific positionalities, but then also thinking about the ways in which this is actually discussed on the ground. So having been co-leading different Asian indigenous community dialogues and events, interculturally, intergenerationally, where elders, youth, academics, drug users, unionists, cultural workers are all in one room, the last thing we tend to do is talk about settlerhood or the term itself. That does kind of get deployed in the conversation at specific points. It's very important to implicate ourselves, as I've discussed, as I've called upon Christos today to think about material conditions. But what I'm trying to say, in alignment with you fully, is that there's not a lot of solidarity that is followed up on from deploying the term. So we kind of always see this in relationship to the ongoing brunt that Indigenous peoples and nations take of systemic violence and thousands of tentacles of settler colonialism pulling us in different directions. So it's conversations like this and the deployment of almost like an apolitical settler moves to innocence that does what Candace Fujikane in 2008 in the book Asian Settler Colonialism says that we're kind of like turning away from Indigenous nations' demands for political justice. That's speaking from an Asian diasporic perspective. And it's kind of extra fitting tonight to be thinking about the ways that this has been circumvented and has been challenged. Because in the mid-2000s, we had Mi'kmaq scholar Bonita Lawrence and South Asian scholar Shikha Diwakar talking about what it means to decolonize anti-racism. In the mid-2010s, we had South Asian scholar Rita Cardamoon and Cherokee scholar Jeff Pointassel in solidarity talking about what it means to unsettle settler colonialism and activate praxis. And now we're kind of moving towards a bit more of an acknowledgement in literature and community of what it means to kind of move beyond just deploying the term and arguing about it. And one thing I'd like to say about this too, is that when I'm thinking about settler, I don't actually believe that when we're deploying it, we're homogenizing all people of color as settlers. We can understand that this can be, and I think you say this in your book, Nishant, at one point, kind of almost like a diagnostic or just like a way to kind of deploy that term as like a means to an end, or at least that's how I see it, that's how I read your work when I'm thinking about settlerhood, when I'm thinking about racialized settlers. So my like cheeky answer in my engagement with this lit and like what I do in community is kind of like, this is good enough. Like we can start at this point and have disconnects, have tension around how settler is utilized, how it's deployed, but like I actually want to see us, again, like build and cross the bridges that we want to actually materially align ourselves. So again, like that's where I think about praxis and the relationship to the term settler, and we need a lot more action, especially in regards to Asian Indigenous solidarity building. So there's limits of settlerhood here, but I really appreciate all the discourse that's ongoing and what people are kind of contending with. But I want to see more, not just kind of going in a roundabout circle, talking about the term, which is how I read some of the engagement right now from Asian diasporic scholars and community.
Yeah, thank you, both of you. I think I was going to go in a slightly different direction, but maybe pick up from where Ty, you left. So I came to this work trying to understand what does it mean to say I'm a settler of color, because it felt like this acknowledgement where we do, and the way we understand settlers, it's like white people are settlers and other people are migrants, refugees, arrivants, and all this different terminology, right? But then realizing that some of us materially benefit from these structures that have been put in place, and that who can have access to education, who has access to good employment, who owns land, who owns property, those are all things that many immigrant communities try to mimic white settlers, right? Following the Canadian dream, following the American dream, isn't a settler dream, and those of us who are following that and have the material benefits of doing it, led me to think that this is that Indians like me who come from caste privilege are acting more like white people, are white people often, materially, socially, economically, culturally, and whatnot, right? But in the scholarship and in activist circles, the work has also been, people have taken up in different directions. There's been a lot of conversations, a lot of debates. So in the book, I try to move away from it to say, like, it doesn't matter if I call someone settler or not. It's what is more important is how are we complicit and benefiting from these structures, and what do we need to show up in solidarity, as both pointed out, to undo these structures, settler colonialism, right? The word is important as an entry point, but then we have to go beyond that to think about what are we actually doing, how are we actually showing up for Indigenous nations, how are we, many scholars have spoken about how so many of us are trained to become part of the Canadian state, right, or the American state, But what do we need to do undo our relationship with those states, right? We can't, because a lot of us pay taxes and we're complicit in all these structures, and yet how can we change our alliance and our orientation on these lands to think about the indigenous land keepers, water keepers of these lands rather than the state, right? The states are imperial settler states, and they don't benefit anyone, right? And so, what is the actual work that we need to do, right? So the book doesn't actually get into so much into what the work needs to be done, because we're all trying to figure out what that means. But the other thing, thinking about solidarity and thinking about migration and thinking about transnational privileges, the work has allowed me to actually also understand the Indian state as a form of a settler colonial state, right? What the Indian state does in Kashmir, what the Indian state does in Northeast, what the Indian state does in Goa, in Punjab, in Hyderabad, and like everything that the Indian state has done has been a replication of European colonial models that many of us become complicit in that, right? Kashmiris have been fighting for sovereignty, and Indians keep moving there. Is a form of settler violence, right? But we don't think about Indians as settlers, right? We think about Israelis as settlers. Israelis take that language and say we are settlers and take pride in that. But in India, we are just all Indians. That we've been here for centuries and we've been Indians, right? But if we look at the history of who's dominant caste, who has caste privilege, there's different conversations in the scholarship where Aryans came as invaders, or Aryans came as nomadic peoples, or Aryan came as however they came, but majority of dominant caste people, North Indian dominant caste people, come from that migration of Aryans coming from Central Asia is probably what we can say, right? Who was there before that, right? Adivasi and indigenous peoples were there, Dalit people were there, Dravidian people were there, and so this word settler has allowed me to really complicate that when I say I'm Indian, when for centuries I've been Indian, and Hindu, that there were people here before that whose land and resources were taken over, right? That Dalit, Adivasi, Dravidian people claim different relationships to those lands. My family can also say we were farmers and we've been growing food for centuries and we are connected to the land and whatnot, but that land relationship is very different from people who have been dispossessed from those lands, right? So historically and contemporarily, dominant caste people in the South Asian context act as settlers and have maintained those powers as settlers, right? So the quote that we started us with about how Indian state thinks about, or Indians think about Adivasis, dominant caste people think about Adivasis, that language is still the same. If you look at the Constitution of India, the way indigeneity or scheduled tribe people are described, it says they're backward, they're shy, these are actual words in the Constitution to say this is who Adivasi is, which is the same language that the Canadian settlers use about indigenous people, right? And so trying to come to that understanding, because if you were schooled in India or I'm schooled in Canada, we don't get that critical understanding, right? But it was for me to understand indigenous scholars here talking about what does it mean to be connected to land, then reflecting and thinking, oh, actually this is very similar to what Adivasi people think about land. This is very similar to a lot of Dalit communities also think about their relationship to land, and not how Brahmins think about land, right? Brahmins have used land to capitalize on land, to privatize land, to take over land, to take over the resources from the land, and that relationship is not then of caring about the land, right? And so in that context, historically dominant caste people have acted as settlers, and the Indian state now continues on that manifestation, right? Continues on what it does in Kashmir, in Northeast, Goa, all these different examples. And then the way Hindu right and Hindutva think about Akhand Bharat, this is a framework that some of you may have heard or not heard, greater India for Hindus, is also a settler aspiration, right? The way they think about not just the boundaries of India, but going beyond the boundaries of India, thinking about Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Tibet, Afghanistan, Myanmar. These are all settler aspirations, right? To say that this land belongs to Hindus, right? Hindus were not indigenous to those lands, but that is what Hindutva claims, that Hindus have always been indigenous. But they were, before there was Hinduism, there were people who were indigenous to those lands. And so in Hindutva's imagination of who Hindu is, for them it's always indigenous, but what this language of settler has allowed me to understand is that Hindus are the settlers, right? And that aspiration to a greater Hindustan, greater Akhand Bharat or lands for Hindu is always about claiming more and more land, right? Which is very similar to what Manifest Destiny was, very similar to what has happened in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, in the US, what's happening in Palestine. These are similar moves of settlers taking in more and more land and claiming more and more land and erasing the histories of people who'd been there for centuries, right? So settler it's very a dubious term. It can do sometimes it's very important and sometimes it just gets messy and people are just fighting. If you see the scholarship that Ty was pointing out, there's just debates of debate. Who's a settler, who's not a settler? And that is not the work we are trying to do, right? We are trying to think about who is being oppressed and what if this analytic is important to then give us the tools to think about how do we unsettle that and how do we undo that, right? So thinking about decolonization in the Canadian context is related to then thinking about decolonization within South Asian context to who is going to get that land, who's going to get the resources back, who's going to get the rights over the lands that their communities have had, and who has been benefiting from that, right? And in all these instances, it took me a while to understand this, but it took that Hindu Brahmins and dominant caste people have constantly for centuries benefited from these structures, right? And that's why to say Indians are settlers in Kashmir is actually a very political thing to say that, right? Because it disrupts this idea that Kashmir is India. Kashmir belongs to India. If you talk to any Indian, they often would say Kashmir is an integral part of India. But who's making that claim? Kashmiris are not making that claim, right? Kashmiris are making that claim for their own sovereignty, but it's the Indian state and the Indians and mostly Hindus who are saying, this is our land, right? When someone has to make those claims over other people and then justify military occupation, justify violence, justify genocide, tells us the fraughtness of that, right? And I think Palestine in the last few years, not just few years, last 70 years, but last 2-3 years has made that very evidently clear how settlers use that language to keep claiming this indigenous land relation to land, but which is not indigenous in any way. It's always a colonial relation. So.
Oh, fantastic. It sort of builds on the next question, too, which I'm going to ask you to start with. You've already sort of mentioned this now. You've been building on this. The transnational linkages between Brahmanical supremacy and white supremacy, and really how oppressed peoples globally experience these structures. So how do we actually recognize them? How do we actually call them out? Since it is a political thing.
So Brahmanism, for those of you, some of you might be familiar with this terminology. Brahmanism is the foundation of the caste structures in Hinduism, right? Brahmanism saying that Brahmins are on the top, and the whole hierarchy structure of which caste belongs to where comes from these Hindu texts, right? And so Brahmanism is not a word that is very commonly used, but it's a very useful framework to understand, like white supremacy, right? Like that tells us the logics of racism and colonialism within European imaginary. Similarly, Brahmanism tells us about how the Indian society, Indian state, pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial imposes a structure on communities, right? So Brahmanism is the core of caste violence, caste apartheid, and has for centuries oppressed caste communities who are not considered with caste, right? So white supremacy is a project of 500 years that we can say, but Brahmanism is a project of at least 2,000 years, right, if not more. So it's the oldest form of oppression and exploitation and violence that we know anywhere in human history. And yet we don't talk about that word, especially if you have grown up in India. This is not a word that you would have come across anywhere, right? Even in North America, it's very recently, after the push from Dalit scholars to say that we have to use this structure, name the structure. Naming that structure is very important, because often when we name the structure, the right-wing Hindu would say this is Hinduphobia, or you being anti-Hindu if you're calling the structure out, right? So calling out is very important in that context. But what is also missed in that, when we don't center a critique of Brahmanism in understanding Indian state and Indian history, is that a lot of scholarship on India about colonialism has been colonizers came and everyone was colonized and we were all oppressed. But what historians have now done the work in the last few decades is to show that how dominant caste people, Brahmin and dominant caste people, actually benefited from colonialism, right? And they colluded with the colonizers. So we were not all equally colonized in the Indian state, which is what, if you are taking classes in social science or humanities, post-colonial theory is an important framework that a lot of people use to think about colonization, British colonization of South Asia, and a lot of people have used that framework to think about colonization globally. That framework would always say that we were all oppressed by the colonizers. But who was writing this framework? These were all dominant caste historians themselves saying that we were colonized, and that's why we can claim this identity of being a person of color when we moved to North America, because we had this colonial history. But the actual accounts of colonialism in South Asia show us that how dominant caste people benefited from this, right? They were partaking in their own colonization because they could benefit from those structures, right? And so Brahminism and white supremacy have always been these projects that have spoken to each other historically and continue to speak now, right? And at this contemporary moment, thinking about Trump, thinking about Modi, they're all manifestations of white supremacy and Brahminism that they benefit from these structures, right? That's why their best friends from Netanyahu with Zionism is a very similar project of occupation, of violence and oppression, right? And so it's important to name these things not just as Modi and Trump are friends, but actually these structures of power of race and caste that enable these cohesions, right? These fusions. They benefit from oppressing Indigenous and Black people here. In India, they benefit from oppressing Dalit, Adivasi, Bahujan communities. They equally benefit from being Islamophobic in both these contexts and the Israeli context as well. And so these are structures, these are transnational projects of oppression and violence, and who's benefiting from them. Naming them as such allows us to really understand how power is distributed and who is claiming victimhood sometimes, right? So a lot of right-wing Hindus claim victimhood. Similarly, how white people under Trump claim victimhood. Similarly, how Israeli Jewish people claim victimhood. These narratives of who's victim is very central to these projects, right? When the actual victims have been the victims who've been facing the violences of these projects for centuries, and yet what we often hear is that white men are becoming victims in the US, or Hindus are becoming, dominant caste Hindus are victims in the US, in the Indian context, right? So if you, so many dominant caste Indians would say we left India because of these reservation policies that were harming them, because the Indian state is giving jobs to Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi communities, and so that's why we have to move here. That's a very common myth that most Indian Hindus, most dominant caste Indians across religions keep perpetuating, right? For in their heads, they are the victims. That also then came up in my work, that they would say we were victims there, and here we are also victims because Indigenous people get subsidies from the state. We are hardworking there, and we are hardworking here, and yet we are the victims because Indigenous people here and Adivasi people there are getting the benefits from the state, right? And so this narrative of victimhood becomes really central to how Brahmins and dominant caste people think about themselves, and it's very similar to them. It's very easily mappable to how white settlers think about themselves here, or Jewish settlers think about themselves in the context of Palestine. And so naming all these things from a dominant caste to unpack, I can't speak to globally oppressed people, but as knowing how my communities have mobilized these structures and who's facing the violence at the other end, and these formulations allow us to name that, and then to also then think about how do we fight against that, right? What is the work that we need to do to fight against Brahminism, but also how do we understand the links between white supremacy and Brahminism, and how they learn from each other. They've been learning from each other for centuries, but intentionally that history has been erased from us, right? Scholars have intentionally done the work of saying that these are different things, and Brahminism is not really a thing because colonization came and then did all this violence in South Asia, so we can't really name of this structure like this, right? So maybe I'll just stop here, but I'm sure you have to add.
Thank you so much. Actually, you did a great job in explaining the transnational linkages, so maybe I'll just skip the part. But when I came here, in terms of transnational linkages, I was new to racism, to be honest, because in India I experienced casteism. But it was not like something very new, because I realized there is a very structurally aligned system, Brahminical supremacy and white supremacy, when it comes to racial or caste purity, or the question of meritocracy. What the example Nishant gave around reservation, it reminded me when I came here, my first interaction with someone who was a Brahmin person, and now they are my friend. But my first interaction, they were like, "Why did you move to McGill?" I'm from McGill, by the way. And there is nothing to be proud of, that's why I never introduced. But they were like, "Why did you move here?" And I was like, "I don't know, I just got an opportunity and I came here." And I asked, "Why did you move here?" They were like, "Oh, because there's a lot of reservation in India and we don't get a seat." And I was like, "Oh, well, so I have an answer too." And they were like, "Oh," I was like, "I also moved here because of reservation, but historical reservation. The reservation that upper caste people keep getting, and the number of the higher enrollment, and how there is the unequal distribution of wealth and resources." And I was like, because I'm a Dalit and I've been historically excluded from a lot of opportunity, and due to that historical reservation, I also moved here. And their next question, they did not get that. Their next question was, "Oh, but McGill does not offer any reservation. How did you get in?" Because I studied, I have a good project, I get it here. Anyway, but that reminds me of, these questions I keep, these kind of interaction keeps happening. In terms of, I don't know if we can call out, especially coming from the positionality that I am from, I'm a Dalit and a woman, and I'm in a job market, by the way. So me calling out, there is a repercussion, to be honest. So it's really difficult to call them out, unless you have power and privilege. But there are ways to address the harms that you see, and it begins with educating ourselves. When I came here, I realized that, it's not just understanding relationship to the land. It is more beyond, because there was the history of slavery. The buildings that built on this land is from the stolen labor as well. So educating myself around the intersections of these oppressive systems is the beginning of addressing these harms. Because I realized when I came here, a lot of things seems normalized, because, as someone from a marginalized community, one of the effect of oppression is a lot of things that is being normalized, you don't even question. For example, it is very normal for a South Asian person to ask my full name. If you're non-South Asian, if you say, "Oh, this is my first name," they'll be like, "Cool." But if I say I'm Shikha, they'll be like, "Oh, but what is your full name?" I was like, "Why do you want to know my full name? What my surname will tell?" And a lot of people will be pissed. They'll be like, "I'm just asking your surname because I just want to know where are you from." I was like, "But my surname does not tell the region." And if I tell them, "Oh, I tell my full name," and they're like, "Oh, where are you from?" And if I say Delhi, they'll be like, "But Delhi is very multicultural, so they cannot know." So they'll be like, "No, where are your parents from?" If I say where my parents from, they will exactly know what kind of Dalit I am. So these are the questions which you will see very normalized. However, these questions is rooted in casteism, because once they know your caste, then they will decide the proximity. The proximity it's like a spectrum of proximity. They will be like, "Oh, some people, how we talk about white saviorism, there is, we call it, upper caste also have a saviorism. So they want to have you friend as a Dalit friend kind of thing. But so there is a proximity, and the proximity could be, "Oh, we can engage with them because we are liberal, but when it comes to celebrating a festival or eating with them, oh, they won't be invited." So there is always a proximity, and
So that's why it starts with knowing your caste, deciding the proximity, and deciding how they're gonna treat you. So I think, and it's not just, like a lot of people think that this is within South Asian community. Caste has traveled so far outside South Asian communities. For example, like one of my experience, my friend, he's still my friend, he's a white man, and you know when you learn other language, you start with learning the swear words. So he learned the swear word. He thought it's a swear word, but it was a caste slur. And when he said, he was like, "Oh, today I'm wearing a shabby clothes. I look like Bhangi." And Bhangi is one of the Dalit community. And I was like, oh my God. And then I educated them. I was like, wherever you learn this word from, this is a caste slur. So, you know, educating ourselves around these oppressive systems is a first step to address these harms and recognizing these harms. Otherwise, there's a lot of things that has been normalized. So I'll just end there by just saying that, you know, it's difficult for me to call out, but I can just tell you how to address the harm.
Yeah, I'll just add, that's wonderful answers to this question. I'm gonna come at it from a Black and Indigenous queer and feminism kind of lens and how I'm trained, how I think about the world. And I have to connect all of this by and through the organization of the nation state. This upholds the state, right? All of these forms of supremacy and nationalisms, at the end of the day, they're there to manifest destiny for the state and anchor it in place. There's no way in this system to imagine otherwise. The whole point of all of this is to make us believe that our destiny is to incorporate into the nation state. That includes Asian diasporic communities, that includes other people of color. That's kind of just how I see this on the ground and kind of in material reality, right? And these are nation states, political formations that seek to actualize the certainty of a future for whatever population is deemed better, right? In this binary, with an indigenous other, with other laborers, with laboring bodies, with whoever slots into that category, right? So that's kind of how I see this in terms of actually legitimately recognizing the interaction of cis heteropatriarchy, of disablement, of race, of indigeneity, right? All of this kind of consolidating into occupying and further actualizing the nation state. And then in terms of how I think it's best to maybe call this out or approach it, I actually kind of think of it as thinking of settler colonialism and nation states as failed projects. Like they don't actually succeed at what they're trying to do, otherwise they wouldn't be anxious about their certainty in the world, right? So I just don't really buy any analysis or perspective that doesn't approach the state as a failed project because it has not eliminated indigeneity. So that's kind of how I'm thinking through this very slowly and carefully. But if we're already approaching solidarity, even on the Asian indigenous end, from this kind of reality, that this is an experimental, failed, one-way kind of track project of looking at the world and trying to organize bodies in a settler colony, it's a lot easier to imagine beyond it, because this is just merely one failed experiment of people who are on a death drive. And there's a lot of grief. I'm not trying to discount kind of the on-the-ground struggle and, you know, liberals who try to make things better through grants and everything else, right? That's important work. But it must be situated in the fact that if we have faith in the state, we have already failed ourselves. That's at least what I think. I'm just gonna say what I think here. And I'm coming at that kind of in tandem with a kind of no borders political philosophy, and I'll end here by quoting Harsha Walia, by saying, instead of racist nationalism defining who constitutes the nation state or the working class, we need a robust and internationalist struggle committed to dismantling the conjoined forces of capitalism, the state, racism, and all hierarchized relations, while nurturing a kinship of relationality and place-based stewardship. So at the end of the day, when I'm thinking through this and I'm thinking through this lens, I'm thinking about how are we going to use knowledge that we generate to kind of cut through these systems and structures. Knowledge is for cutting, not just for understanding, in my view. So what are ways in which we can further nurture kinship across difference and kind of create dense kind of political formations that can think beyond the settler state and take action beyond the settler state to kind of affirm life in the face of death right now. Yeah.
Ty, actually, I want to have a drink of water.
Yeah. Thank you.
Because I'm going to ask you the next question.
Sounds good.
So
Fire up now, I'm ready to go.
You're ready to go? Okay. So my next question actually builds on this. On the various barriers in our society that prevent racialized diaspora communities from being in solidarity with Indigenous peoples within the framework that you've talked about. So I imagine each of you is going to have a very different perspective on this. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, this is my bread and butter. This is what's been driving me crazy like all of my life. Like I feel actually crazy when I talk about this, not because I don't think I've come to really meaningful engagements and relationships in relation to this question, but just this is so complex. Like at the risk of sounding trite, like everything's complicated. So this is my one way in on this. And I'm thinking a lot lately about the relationship between anti-racism and multiculturalism and decolonization. And these things are not mutual. These things are not parallel. There's actually a really complicated history we need to get at when we're thinking about solidarity in and of itself. So if we're thinking about the history of race and so-called Canada, we're thinking about the ways in which Indigenous and Indigenous life becomes kind of racialized into a category and becomes an equivalent minority group to, for example, other Asian diasporic communities, right? So when we're thinking about the way in which the state thinks about indigeneity still to this day, contrary to a lot of reconciliation discourse, Indigenous people exist as a racialized group. I carry my status card with me. That's a form of racialization, right? That's a signal that I'm an individual racialized body in this colony. So when I'm thinking through that, I'm thinking a lot about settler multiculturalism. That's kind of been gaining traction since the 1970s. We're becoming more progressive. We can accommodate difference. We have more festivals now, right? But none of that actually deals with the fact that Indigenous identity and place-based identity is rooted in sovereignty and relationships to land. Land has never really meaningfully entered this conversation a lot of the time, and that's kind of what ticks me off. That makes me really frustrated. But that doesn't invalidate really long-standing efforts from different Asian diasporic groups and organizations and writers, such as Rita Wong, who I consider under this umbrella of Decolonize Asia, like this movement to decolonize our relationships to indigeneity through the lens of land and rather than whiteness, and like what that kind of brings about. So instead of thinking about coexisting in like a multicultural Canadian utopia, we're thinking about other ways to imagine our relations to each other that don't consist of just you're another racialized group. Let's just kind of take it to the state and think about ways to be further included, right? So I'm kind of thinking here also with Lee Miracle, who Stalo matriarch and an activist, and speaking of transnational connections, went to China in the 70s and went around the world and was kind of like drawing on these transnational understandings and interconnectedness of things to actually take it back to the settler colony of Canada and say, you know what, anti-racism kind of falls into this trap. It's kind of a trap, as Miracle says, like fighting for a piece of pie without knowing where the pie comes from. Right? So when we're really thinking about that quote, we're thinking about the ways in which anti-racism kind of makes this slippage and makes mistakes in terms of kind of equating itself to liberation or equating itself to a fair and just future. Well, it's totally valid to be thinking and critiquing and really thinking along the lines of race. These are real effects, right, that are also brought upon to Indigenous people because we're racialized, right? I'm not saying to reject race. I'm just saying that when we're thinking about the promises and fulfillments of anti-racism as an institutional policy from like Government of Canada standpoint, it's a complete and utter failure to like actually be in relationship to land. Because the settler state never wants to say, this isn't our land, take it all back, right? There needs to be some sort of anchoring to this like promise of a better future as a collective in terms of like, I'm Canadian, I'm Asian Canadian. So I'm thinking a lot about that through what Binash Jaffrey calls the Asian Indigenous impasse. This is exactly addressing what I was just talking about, how this is a structurally produced relationship when there's kind of like, it's like jargon, but like incommensurability. So just like kind of uneven and awkward relationships from maybe an Asian diasporic perspective or what have you, compared to an Indigenous perspective when it comes to land. So these things are quite convoluted when we're thinking about race and all of the relations and complications that come from the frameworks I was just discussing and from the point of view of the state. So this kind of frames, again, like all of these barriers, right? When we connect it back to land, it's not just about the barriers themselves and overcoming it, it's actually reorienting to land and kinship. That makes the most sense to me, and that's in alignment with Indigenous lands and life. So all of that's to say this makes relationships really challenging and puts a huge strain on us, like intergenerationally across different languages, based on where we're all at in our lives. But what I can say is that if land is taken out of the equation, we're merely repeating kind of like the rhetoric of Canadian liberal settler multiculturalism, the rhetoric of race relations that kind of limits our imagination and limits our ability to be in community with one another, for the very reason that land doesn't exist and anchor us into place. So yeah, I think I'll end there because I'm thirsty.
Go ahead.
Actually, I resonate what you said. It limits our scope and understanding as well. Like, because when Anita keeps staring at me, keep your mic close. When I came here, when I was new, a lot of people were like, hey, you should go to museums. And there are a lot of museums around McGill that have Indigenous history, and thanks to those museums, I learned a lot too. However, there was a question in my heart, and there is a question, there is no conclusion, no criticism, no, like nothing. It's just a question that appeared in my head. I was like, if this land belongs to Indigenous community, why I'm learning from museums? Why that is so siloed in four walls? I don't have answer to this. Is not criticism, it's just a question that came to me. And when I went inside, there was a lot of things that I learned, yes. But and the another example about this being, the history being siloed, in a lot of department I have seen there is a minor course on Indigenous studies, Indigenous feminism, but as a student when I was taking courses, I did not see the presence of Indigenous histories or framework in other courses. And another way of, seeing that how these histories are siloed in just one course and how it's not traveling across. However, when you see Eurocentric frameworks, you will see them in research methods, you will see in a lot of courses, you will see in the citations, reading list. And I was wondering, I was like, this is very weird. So I think, structurally, there are a lot of barriers in that, and these barriers are very intentional in creating that when a newcomer like me, I can speak as someone who's coming from India and new, it's really hard to see it because there's a lot of barriers. So I think one of the things, like I pointed before as well, educating ourselves is really important. And one of the things that really helped me understand and see through is understanding about settler colonialism in Canada. Because the idea that they sell, that Canada is a land of opportunity, but it's more than that. There is a history of violence that a lot of people does not know. There is a history of Indian residential school systems, and it's difficult for a newcomer, a new immigrant, to understand this because as we land on this land, we are expected to assimilate in the culture. And what culture is that? It's a very, settler-created culture, colonial culture, and there are harms too. But it's really difficult to see those harms unless we educate ourselves. So I feel that, as an immigrant community, and also it happens that we become complicit in those harms. Even though if we don't know, we end up being complicit. So one of the things that in my own research, one of the reflective questions, I had research questions that are different, but one of my reflective questions was, how do I do this research where I'm not being complicit in producing the same harm? Because I'm in this predominantly white colonial institution where my training around PhD is happening through their lenses. In research method class, the relationship that they are teaching, in terms of understanding what consent look like, in understanding, a lot of writing used to piss me off, because they were from victimized lens. Thankfully, I read the work of a lot of Indigenous scholars, like Eve Tuck or Audra Simpson, and then I learned, I was like, oh my God, this is deficit lens. And so, from even the smallest thing, when you're reading, what you're reading, and how it can, or what you're writing actually. I encourage my students, now I teach at McGill, I encourage my students, whenever there is assignment, the first thing that I talk about is ethics of writing.
And because a lot of students really want to write an assignment on indigenous community, on different marginalized communities, on immigrants, and the first thing that they have lens is the victim lens, like, oh, we need to save them. So I talked to them about, you need to question your deficit framing. You need to question your extractive framing. Like, you cannot just say that, oh, they are suffering. Who are responsible for suffering? Is the onus has to be on system. Like, even in our writing, we are reproducing that harm, even if we have intention to understand the issue. So those are the things that, that becomes barrier if you are in an institution that endorses in the deficit framing. So it really takes an effort to move out of those systems or move out of those frameworks and engage with the frameworks that really teaches you how to move away from very colonial structures. And it is not possible when you see your course outline is very Eurocentric. So, thank you.
I don't think I have much to add to everything you both have said, but since your prompt was also thinking through oppositionalities, I think what I found in my conversations when I was doing field work with other Indians, to try to engage in a conversation to think about this as someone else's land. We are here as settlers, and how do we understand Canada as a settler state? One thing that kept coming in those conversations, and it's the same thing that keeps coming up in other conversations that I have with dominant class people about any issue, social issue, is this sense of superiority, that we are so much better than everyone else, that we have figured things out, and we don't have anything to learn, and everyone has to learn from us. Right, and that comes up in how, and that's a product of caste, right? That this, the dominant caste people can think of themselves as superior, and that's how they then make Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi communities inferior to themselves, and that sense of self is so constructed in relationship to dehumanizing someone else, right? And that dehumanization then carries into the diaspora, and so there were sometimes people would just say wild things that I would just know, I have no idea how to respond to it, and it took me a while to start understanding what is behind that, right? So, for instance, I would ask them about, we were colonized, and we have this history in South Asia of being colonized by Britishers, and this is a similar history here of white settlers coming in and colonizing indigenous people, and more than a handful of times, the response was that we were able to defeat the colonizers because of our Hindu culture, Hindu values, family values, and education, and indigenous people were not able to do that, right? And it's just like, it's such a wild logic that people would say, but then that's the same thing how anti-blackness works, right? It's the same thing that so many Indians and South Asians would talk about black folks as something is lacking in them, and we have figured it out, right? And that what we have figured it out is that we have strong family values, that we care about education, and we care about good paying jobs, and we care about home ownership, right? And if you're making all those things, then you have made it, and you've become a model minority, and everyone else needs to learn from us, right? And if others are not doing that, then something is wrong with them, right? Which is similar conversations around whether or not we should have, I live in the US now, so whether or not to have universal healthcare, right? And people will be like, why should I pay for someone else's healthcare? I have a job, I have insurance, and I can pay for mine. I don't need to care about others, right? And that I have a job is because I'm so merited, I'm so educated. And so that logic is, even within the most liberal dominant caste space, that logic continues, that we are superior than others. And those others are a whole range of people in South Asia and in North America and globally, that people can say that because of our values, we have done this, right? And so for showing up in solidarity to undo that work of dehumanizing someone else and making yourself superior, I don't really know what it takes to do that work, right? Because fascist agendas can keep reproducing that logic again and again and again, and people find so much comfort and so much material benefits from that ideology that it's really hard to undo, right? And it reproduces it as intentional as I want to be around these things. Because of the history that I carry with myself. I probably reproduce it all the time without even knowing it, right? No matter how conscious I'm trying to be in my head. And that's the same logic of whiteness, right? And that's why we haven't been able to figure out how to fight whiteness or caste. And it's not, we have not been able to figure out, people have been figuring out and fighting back. So I don't want to undermine that work that's been happening for centuries. Yet that it's in the psyche, it's in the DNA in ways that we have to do so much educational work in ourselves, within our communities, and the institutions that we are at, to recognize someone else as human, right? And I think I've just, as I'm not that old, but I'm aging, and I've realized that like it's become that question is like, how do we get trained and socialized to see others as not human? Right? What is the logic, what drives my communities to say we are superior and someone else deserves that because they're not human enough, right? And it's the same logic that it's reproduced every day, like, so again, like what all the wars that Trump is fighting right now, that those lives don't matter, right? That we can keep throwing bombs again and again on all these different countries because somehow it's in people's imagination it's okay to kill others, right? And that idea that it's okay to kill someone else is so ingrained in people who have privileges, be it class, be it race, be it caste, be it gender, be it religion, that I think I used to think in my 20s and 30s that I feel like we can undo these structures and we'll figure it out. And now I'm like what is the psyche behind this? And how do we get to that psyche is the barrier that the aged part is like, we should just love each other. Like, why is it so hard to love each other? But it is so hard to love each other, right? We've made it impossible to love each other because people keep benefiting from these structures, right? And I think just witnessing that who's benefiting from like not loving, and that so Modi can keep coming back into power and keep doing all the things he's doing. Trump can run the third time next year or year after, or because people are supporting them. There are generally people who believe that these people are good people, right? And it sounds very simplistic to say someone is good and someone is bad. Because that's what academia teaches us, that we can't have these binaries of who's good and bad, but sometimes I'm just lost at that question. It's like, how is someone so inherently evil that they can keep doing this? And it doesn't need to be Trump and Modi, right? Those are very easy examples to catch on to, but there are people in my family who have regular jobs and regular education, live regular lives, and can still carry so much hate for others, right? And that hate, that is so normalized, that it is normalized. I don't know if you saw this morning I saw this stat that Gen Z boys are more misogynist than baby boomer boys were. And that's ridiculous to think about, right? We've been talking about like how we've figured out gender in the last 10 years. And until yesterday we were saying Gen Z babies were all non-binary and trans and queer, but then these Gen Z boys are growing up, teenager boys, and are saying that my wife should not work. Right, and that stat is just, yeah, I saw it this morning and I was like, what am I reading? How all the work that we've been doing gets reproduced again and again, right? And it's not just we can't blame Trump for that, right? Or the MAGA movement or the white supremacist movement. It's something happening even with all the resources that younger folks have now to think about gender in much more critical ways than even 10, 15 years ago I had. And yet, boys can be this, become more misogynist than baby boomers were, right? And baby boomers, we all know how misogynist they were and are, right? And so, so I'm going in circles, but I think I just so many times go to bed, like, how can someone carry so much hate? What is it that we want to hate someone so much that we are willing to see them die and participate in their death, right? And I think that's the barrier.
It is. So much there. We have audience questions.
I did not want to end on that.
I'll come back. I'll come back. I'll come back.
Any questions? Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. Shikha, I want to ask you a question. It's kind of like tangential to all that was talked about today. It's about the usage of the term Dalit. I mean, like, maybe more than recently, a lot of scholars, especially like kind of leading in on the Indian scholar Anand Taltonde, he's written pretty extensively about the usage of the term. Well, essentially the idea is that it's not a fixed category, people can't like naturally ascribe to it and such. And he's talked about the increasing like depoliticization of the term, using the term, where kind of the essential original idea was that you use the term to identify like your political position, your position of being oppressed by the state and the oppressing class, the ruling classes. But nowadays it's either being used kind of casually in the way that like people have it as a part of their inherent identity, or it's not being used at all because it's associated with it's being associated with something inherent, and that's why it's sort of as being shameful. So like, for example, I'm from Tamil Nadu, and there are castes that still, even if they're identified within the scheduled caste category for reservation, they're arguing to not be called as Dalits because they're like, well, you know, we had this like legacy of being warriors, so we don't want to be called this thing that others who we perceive as being so much more worse than us call themselves. So I guess my question is, what like going forward in terms of like personal and social mass movement politics, what can we do to sort of rehabilitate, bring back a more productive usage of the term? What would that look like societally?
Actually, a lot of communities who are caste oppressed, generally I use the term caste oppressed because in academia a lot of people do not, there is no, not much usage around the term. But there are a lot of caste oppressed communities who do not identify with the term Dalit. Some identify with, some likes to call them Ambedkarite, or there are people who converted to Buddhism, so they like to call them Buddhist. And each has their own rationale and reasons, and I respect all the rationales and reasons. And also this signifies that caste oppressed community is very diverse, not homogenized. So my reason to use the term Dalit is deeply political in North America, because that's the term has been used to lead the discourse and anti-caste discourse as well. Back home, I was always a scheduled caste because my caste certificate says that. Moving forward, and also the term Dalit has been understood from different lenses. Like recently this year, there is an amazing article by Dr. Shikha Patel and John Bhupalan, who the name of the article is Rooted in the Soil. And they are talking about Dalitness and the term Dalit and how it emerged, and moving away from like a lot of people understand Dalit as a word that comes from broken. You know, there is a negative connotation. But over a period of time, like historically, Dalit term has been like adopted to a certain form of resistance, like by, you know, Dalit Panther or, you know, Ambedkar, and, you know, so there are different histories that are associated with the term, and the histories in North is quite different from histories in the South, and I'm not from the southern part of India, I'm from North, I'm from Delhi. So I feel that in order to contribute to that movement, I also like to use the term Dalit. And moving forward, like there will be multiple terms because that represent the heterogeneity of my communities. Yeah.
Hello, my My name is Harjas. Looking at the caste hierarchical system in relation to being a settler in these lands, there are underlying echoes of like capitalism, mimicry to dominant groups, which in this case could be the European settler colonizers, and an increase in violence amongst different caste or racial categories in Canada. Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote the book on caste, The Origins of Discontent, she talks about this idea of in-group sentinels that keep the hierarchy in place and enforced. And additionally, when people move into these new spaces, there is this expectation to assimilate and become one with the dominant group. So here it could be like be a singular Canadian. How do we understand our positionality in efforts and in our responsibility towards decolonization when this artificially constructed hierarchy just continues to be reinforced in every domain we work in?
Sure, I can start. Yes, I think that's a really important question and a really challenging question to think about. I think I'm thinking of a few different ways of thinking about this question. Even in the dominant frameworks, right, of thinking about whiteness and white supremacy and how that operates in North America, who is Indian and who is Hindu also becomes one thing, right? There's only one way to be Hindu, or there's only one way to be Indian, right? And the idea is that all Hindus are Indians and all Indians are Hindus, and then they're all vegetarian, they all do yoga, they all celebrate Holi, and they all watch Bollywood, right? And that in itself is a very racist trope to reduce the heterogeneity of all the people who come from South Asia, right? But then Hindu Indians benefit from that logic as well, and they reproduce that, right? And so having vegetarian-only restaurants or saying that all Indians are vegetarian, right, which is not statistically not a fact. Yet most non-South Asians in North America, the way they would be introduced to Indian food is through vegetarian food, right? Or what they would know about Hinduism is yoga. They might know about Gandhi and non-violence and colors and spices, right? And that's a construction of white supremacy, but also a self-produced construction, right? Because it benefits some people, the minority who are vegetarian and who may do yoga, right? And it works to then say there's no caste because we are all the same. There's no religious differences or violences. It completely erases Muslims in the as an Indian community. They're being erased in India, but also in the diaspora through that construction, right? And that's why the question about white supremacy and Brahmanism is very important to think about the experiences of Muslims in the diaspora and back in India. So I think for me that would start from like saying there's no one Indian. There's zillions of ways of being how people show up, and the way we are reduced to that one identity is a logic of Brahmanism and white supremacy together. And so to fight that, but also then to fight back against, and then in that heterogeneity, figuring out our internal violences, right? And that's why naming caste, naming Islamophobia, naming Kashmir, occupation of Kashmir is very important to keep doing that work, both from the white case and the dominant caste case, right? The dominant caste, that's the reason Hindutva has become successful in the diaspora, because they've been able to work on that reduction of Indianness, right? That's the only palatable way of consuming Hindus and Indians, and to changing that palatability and respectability that comes with saying we care about the nature, we care about the animals, and that's why we don't eat meat, right? Which is not true. And all the violences that it raises in the name of vegetarian food, right? And that's one of the tropes. There are multiple tropes like this, that, right? Yoga, what is the history of yoga, and how do we practice yoga? Where does yoga come from, and who gets to practice it now? The violence of Bollywood, violence of festivals like Holi, which was yesterday, right? Holi, Diwali, they're all casteist Brahminical festivals, and yet we now Hindu groups are asking across North America to have holidays on those days. And under multiculturalism, we can ask for that. But then what does it mean to celebrate those festivals and be recognized, right? So I think that fight is both internal and external in terms of unsettling everything that we understand by what an Indian is.
I think your question is really interesting because a couple of years ago, like I was delivering this talk and I was criticizing how institutions push the lens of homogeneous on us. Because when I came here, I was sometimes woman of color or South Asian or international student or immigrant. And one time someone called me first generation learner. I was like, excuse me. And when they said first generation learner, I asked them, I was like, what does that mean? And they were like, oh, you know, people who are entering university for the first time in their entire generation. Yes, like in my family, I'm the first person to enter university and come this far for PhD. But that does not make me first generation learner. Because my community, I come from, my community is a washer community, and they are so much aware of clothing, like what cloth and how to preserve each kind of material, they're like textile experts. How to handle different kind of clothing and how to preserve them, even how to color them or stitch them. I wrote an entire article about how I learned actually research method from my grandma and how she taught me quilt making from putting different patches together and how that actually helped me to understand research method. And I was like, I am not first generation learner, excuse me. But then I understood this term and how they are putting this lens on me. And I was like, okay, you can call me first generation university student, not a learner, because my ancestors and my grandmothers were really skilled. And sometimes I regret coming to university. I'm like, if I were with them, I would have learned a lot of skills rather than being in a university learning 4 theories. That doesn't even work. So I think it's an important question to think about your positionality because system keep pushing a homogeneous lens on you. And for their convenience, they'll keep pushing your identity in different spaces. So yeah.
One more question?
Last one.
I just had a question regarding, we have language struggles going on in the country right now in India where various states are making it harder for people to express themselves in different languages, or they're, especially in the southern states, they're taking away the southern languages to make Hindi a priority. I was just wondering what your opinion was on that because it does tie into power and it dictates who can express themselves.
I am a Hindi speaker, but I find this logic very weird. I want to use a different word, but I cannot because there is a video camera there. I am surprised by the irony back home that we take pride in the diversity. And one of the diversity we have is linguistic. And then we are pushing this narrative that, oh, we all need to speak in Hindi. And it happens here as well. Like sometimes people see me and start speaking in Hindi, and I pretend that I'm not from India or doesn't speak Hindi. I was like, what? I don't understand. I like to play that game. But yeah, it's really an irony that the thing that we take pride on, the diversity, and yet we are trying to strip that down and push Hindi and saying that, oh, Hindi is official language or whatnot. I was like, there are 22 official languages and there are multiple dialects. So I don't understand, I don't think so that they are saving anything. They're just trying to homogenize and play a power move, and that has disrupted a lot of dynamics in other states where they are now trying to push the regional language on the people who are, this is how they create the disruption. Now they are like, oh, you have to speak Marathi. Oh, you have to speak, if you're in this state, you have to speak this language. But then, but we are linguistically diverse. So are you trying to erase the diversity? So that's the irony I feel in the entire debate.
Yeah, I'm also a Hindi speaker, but Hindi itself, the language that my grandparents spoke were what now we call as dialects, but their own languages for centuries. Right? So Hindi has the what we understand as the Hindi belt in North India, that comes from erasure of all these languages that people had for centuries, right? Some were written, some were not written. But I can't speak the language that my grandparents speak. My dad can't speak the language his mother speaks. My mother can, and I've learned some Braj Bhasha from my mom. But in this idea of what Hindi is, everything has been erased, right? That heterogeneity and the diversity of what languages do. So I see Hindi as a colonizer's language, right? Even as a Hindi speaker, because I know I don't have access to the language that even a generation before people in my community were speaking, right? And the regions that they came from had a language, right? And so, and Hindi, like as the history of Hindi, it's like 100-year-old language, the way we understand it now, right? There were multiple renditions and different things that now have been homogenized as Hindi, but it's also meant the erasure of Urdu, which was for so many people in North India, Hindi and Urdu worked together, and until the 60s and 70s, people knew how to write in Urdu, not in Hindi, and then how Islamophobia works and erasure of that. So just following the trajectory of Hindi and how the Indian state has relied on it, keeps relying on this idea of one language, one nation, and one religion, and the whole the ironies on fighting that, or the ironies behind that, but the fascism behind that too, right? Like we say English is a colonizer's language, and we need to take English away, but then you can't replace one colonizing language within another, right? And then to also what we understand Hindi belt, there's so many different languages there, right? And North Indians have been blinded by this idea of Hindi being our language, that their own languages have been erased, and which can only then lead to everything that's happening, all the resistance that we're seeing now, and then the backlash against migrant Hindi speakers in South and other parts of the country, right? Like that this obsession with language, rather than letting people just speak what they speak and have spoken, and claiming this, which is a history on Turtle Island as well, right? Forcing English on indigenous communities and English as a global language, and that English is the only language that we can all come here and talk about, talk and critique in. Critique English is also already so layered and complicated, but Hindi's aspiring aspiration to become the colonizer's language I don't support that. I rather speak the language that my grandmother was speaking, right? But that's been taken away systematically. And now English has taken away all of that, but Hindi cannot be the solution to that.
Final thoughts, maybe? All right, last question. Last question. Like the same thing.
Yeah. I'm
Get special.
Neha, which is quite amazing because in India, every stone you turn over, there's an answer. I really appreciate this panel from Ty, Shikha, and Nishant. It's like being blasted from India and coming to the space where you're like, okay, there's just so much you have to think about. But actually, I had a question for Ty. Do you feel like, do you believe that there is a deliberate structural positioning of the so-called Canadian state into separating the communities further from coming into solidarities? Because I was looking at like the Asian Indigenous, the founding, the body that you have, and it's already refreshing for me because when I came here, that was what I was searching for, because I felt like an absolute imposter, not because of the imposter syndrome, because coming from India with all of these issues and layers, and then coming here and then again dealing with that same double, triple sort of layers. So I just want to know your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Yeah, that's such a good question. So to kind of return to multiculturalism and these kind of logics that are at play now, that's kind of in contrast to how it used to be, like historically speaking, when we're thinking about Asian Indigenous relationality, when we're thinking about migrant labor, when we're thinking about the CPR, Canadian Pacific Railroad, and all of that. There are these kind of logics of like trying to like defamiliarize our relations. So you're kind of put into a specific camp of labor, or you're put next to somebody on a cannery line, even historically speaking. Like, even if we're thinking about what I find interesting, dynamics within the Asian diaspora. This is from an East Asian perspective, but when we're thinking about who was placed where on the cannery line in terms of history, we had Chinese migrant labor men put next to Indigenous women on a cannery line. Whereas in another context, we also had Japanese men as fishermen. So like kind of getting into these in-group dynamics and what the state saw as like gendered and racialized peoples who needed to be put into different compartments alongside to each other because of their weird fetishistic like colonial mentalities at the time. That's like a little bit of a just like rant on where it was then, but now we take it to like now when we're thinking about multiculturalism, there's actually an investment and excitement over familiarizing relationships. When we're thinking about cross-cultural contact, we're thinking about it in the context of what it brings to the state. We're thinking about the fact that it's celebratory. We're thinking about the fact that this is kind of a signifier. It's showing to the world that multiculturalism is successful. It works. Look at us. We're playing nice, right? But there's like kind of a benefit for the state to frame this as productive and good and beneficial, when in reality, the kind of point that I'm getting at is that this is through the very logics we're coming into knowing each other of the state. So like, yes, there's a lot of importance in acknowledging that there's solidarity on the ground and it's happening, but to me, where I want to problematize it and kind of be a bit more hypercritical is that if we're not actually thinking about Indigenous kinship as opposed to citizenship and that relationality, that's where it already becomes a little bit problematic for me, because the last thing I wanted to say about this is when we're returning back to what I just said about CPR and 150 years of all of these relations, when that first started, Indigenous communities were the ones to take care of migrants and migrant laborers when the state didn't actually want to. So like Dorothy Christian from these territories, an elder, actually tells stories pretty frequently, which are important to hear, which is about like early Indigenous communities healing and like bringing folks to the land and teaching people what it actually means to be in place at the same time as they're being exploited as laborers for the settler state. So it's very complicated. I don't have all the answers, but I kind of still want to celebrate what folks are doing together in solidarity, but problematize what we're leaning towards and reaching towards. Because if it's not towards like instituting more of a kinship framework and thinking beyond the settler state, we're still entrapping ourselves in a system that we're trying to escape, right? So I don't know, I'm in a bit of a rant here because it's still challenging, but I'm like spending so much time even thinking through this question in my research. But yeah, that's my rant.
Maybe 30 seconds from each of you on where hope lies. As a final thought.
I think
Got it on a good road here.
when before Q&A, Nishant gave an answer that clarified there is no hope.
That'll be the answer, unless he changes it.
I mean, like hope is a big word. I don't know. Like we often say things which feels utopia in the current geopolitics, and I feel whatever is happening, I'm hopeless. But I think one of the hope is like, you know, one of the point Nishant said about, you know, treating each other as human. I'm like, that's basic and bare minimum, you know, among each other. It is very easy to hate on people. Like one person say one wrong thing and then there is a cancel culture. Like we don't give people opportunity to grow, learn from each other. I'm not saying that you have to entertain harm, because a lot of people who are coming from marginalized identities, it is really difficult to expect from us that, oh, keep loving your oppressor kind of thing and keep giving opportunity, because that's toxic and that creates more harm. But I don't know, I have no answer towards this, but hoping that, you know, in like a lot of Indigenous frameworks talk about relationality and relationship building. So how we can envision that relationality and relationship building in a way that we create a genuine space to grow and grow this relationship in a way where we can move towards solidarity. Because solidarity as a word I have seen that used as a buzzword a lot, and it is not like, people often say, oh, I'm in solidarity with this. But my next question is, what are your steps towards solidarity? Like, what does it mean? And people often say, oh, we need to do relationality, relationship building, and they quote Indigenous scholars around it. But my question is, but they are talking about their relationship building. What is your relationship building? What are your steps towards building relationship towards land, building relationship towards people, building relationship across marginalized community, and also unlearning our privileges? We all are sitting on certain kind of privileges. And our privileges comes as a cost. It is stolen from someone or some community. Do we even know? Like, a lot of us might have home here on this land. Do we even know on whose land our home is on? Like, those questions. It's really good to keep thinking about those questions. And like, a lot of questions might not have answer, but at least you are like centering those questions with an intention that we will move towards these relationships, these solidarity that is rooted in some meaning, but not a buzzword. And one of my criticism is towards academia, like criticism case towards myself. Like, we use a lot of words, and there is a language war. I will learn, like, English is not my first, second, third language, nothing. And I was like, I just learned this word today, and it changed tomorrow. It's like they want to be inclusive in the language. Like, a lot of researchers say, oh, we do a research with Indigenous communities, not on them. And I'm sitting with a question, I was like, but it looks on. I don't understand this English language war. So I think, like, thinking about the words we are using, and use, like, word carry power and weight. So I think my hope is to, when we are using the word like solidarity, make sure that you engage with the steps that you are taking in terms of creating those solidarity. When you are saying, oh, like, we engage in relationality or relationship building, what are your steps in moving towards this relationship building where you're acknowledging your privileges, unlearning your privileges, addressing the harm that your positionality might create in that relationship with whatever relationship you are in. So I think that's my hope, like being very mindful of what we do.
So there's this mayor, his name is Ken Sim in Vancouver, and this brings me so much joy. Like, Ken Sim has been a conduit of such wonderful solidarity building on the ground from so many folks. We're talking about elders who are stepping out of like their political climate and reality to challenge themselves, and this includes like Chinese and Japanese elders and folks whose English isn't their first language. They're coming to City Hall to basically yell at Ken Sim and say, look at what you're doing to Native folks on the ground. Look at what you're doing by trying to roll back everything in terms of harm reduction. Look at what you're doing materially to like taking it at our community. So it makes me actually really happy, not that Ken Sim is in power, because he will lose the next election. I can say that for sure. But it makes me really happy that Ken Sim has been this conduit for organizing and thinking about class and thinking about taking it to your own community by and through relationships to indigeneity. So what I mean by that is using class as an anchor point to think, even though Ken Sim is the first Asian Canadian mayor, right, in Vancouver, that isn't inherently a good thing. And we're kind of thinking about what this means. And yeah, it just brings a smile to my face to think about what's going on right now and who's getting riled up and who's in the face of Ken Sim for all the sessions at City Hall and all the media outlets, and yeah, it feels good in a weird way.
Last words.
I have to be hopeful.
Yes.
As you can probably all tell, I'm a very hopeless person in all the meanings of hopelessness. But I think, and as academics, I think in academia we also get trained to be hopeless about the world, right? Like we are trained to be pessimist, and so over the last few years I've been trying to unlearn that pessimism, even though the world every day to wake up in this world and read news from across it is horrifying. And I think, like Ty, I think what you said resonated with me, because I think when I'm looking for hope, I look at what activist groups are doing. Because as an academic, I know my language and the way I think about the world is pessimist, but somehow activists can still show up every day and do the work they're doing across large number of issues, across large number of communities, across large number of geographies. But they have something, most of them have something to, they can come with the hope that we can fight this and find something else, right? Whereas most of my academic friends, we just critique everything that is, we learn to critique and be pessimist about the world, right? And so I try to just find these amazing things that activists across the globe keep doing every day, which is like the only source of hope in this world, right? Because they do the work that we all should be doing, but we all don't do that work and can't do that work for 1,000 different reasons. But whoever shows up to fight against the smallest thing to the biggest thing is doing something that gives me